Welcome back to Vaulted World Secrets. And if this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found us. Thank you so much for spending your time with me tonight. Before we get into it, if you had access to one sealed chamber in history, one room that has never been opened anywhere in the world, which would you choose and why? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Now, let's get into it. The document I am about to read to you was catalogued in 1994 inside a climate controlled archive subsection of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo under the reference designation KMT 0041. It was not publicized. It was not presented at symposiums. It was folded into a manila envelope, labeled in pencil with the words, "Do not cross reference pending review," and then it was placed in a drawer that, as far as I can determine, no one opened again for nearly 30 years. I found it because of a clerical error. Someone had misfiled it under the surname of a Belgian archaeologist who had worked the Lisht site in the early 1980s, and I was pulling her other field notes for an unrelated project on Middle Kingdom burial orientation. I have spent most of my career doing exactly this kind of work: the background research, the archive pulls, the cross referencing that no one writes papers about, and I have learned that the most important things are almost always in the wrong drawer. When I opened the envelope, expecting survey sketches, I found instead 14 handwritten pages in English, with passages transcribed from hieratic script along the margins, and a single photograph paper clipped to the front, showing a limestone threshold seal with a crack running diagonally across its lower left corner. I have spent 7 months attempting to verify the identity of the woman who wrote these pages. I have a first name only. She signed each entry with the initial and the name Renata. I have a professional designation. She describes herself in the opening lines as a secondary epigrapher attached to an Italian-led excavation operating under a temporary antiquities license issued in the spring of 1992. I have found no record of her in the official excavation reports from that season. Her name does not appear on any crew manifest I can locate. I have contacted the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities twice. I have not received a response. What I have is her account. And because I believe that some records are too important and too strange to remain in a drawer, I am going to read it to you now, in full, exactly as she wrote it. I have changed nothing. I have corrected not a single spelling. What you are about to hear is the unedited field record of a woman who was asked to do a job, who went into a place she should not have gone alone, and who came out believing something that I am not prepared to argue with her about. I say that as someone who has spent 20 years being told, in various polite and impolite ways, that women in this field are prone to exactly the kind of interpretation I am about to present to you. I am presenting it anyway. Her account begins on the 14th of March, 1992, at what she describes as the Lisht North Secondary Shaft Complex, a site approximately 60 kilometers south of Cairo, on the edge of the Fayum Depression, where the desert flattens into something almost aggressive in its blankness, as though the land itself has given up trying to be interesting and is simply daring you to find something beneath it. She writes, "I want to be precise about why I was there alone. I want that understood from the start because I know how the rest of this will read, and I want it on record that I did not make careless choices." Dr. Paola Ferretti, our lead epigrapher, had developed a severe respiratory infection and was evacuated to Cairo on the morning of the 12th. The site permit required that at least one qualified epigrapher be present during any chamber access. This was a condition of our license and not a suggestion. I hold the secondary qualification. The crew had already set the rigging on shaft 4-B. Pulling everyone out for what we expected to be a 48-hour absence would have meant retensioning the line anchors and shifting sand, which carries its own risks. The decision was made by the site director, not by me, that I would conduct a preliminary photographic survey and basic inscription transcription while Paula recovered. I was not going in to do anything heroic. I was going in to take photographs and copy glyphs. I had with me the following equipment, and I want the inventory preserved because it matters later. 1. Battery-powered halogen survey lamp rated at 200 watts. 1. Backup kerosene oil lamp. 1. 35mm camera loaded with ISO 400 film. A notebook with a hard cover. 6 pencils, a roll of drafting tracing paper for rubbing, a measuring tape, a hand-drawn site plan from the previous week's survey, 2 liters of water, a dry ration pack, my personal compass, and 1 radio transmitter set to the camp frequency. I was wearing my standard field kit, canvas trousers, a long-sleeved linen shirt. The linen was practical, not romantic. It breathes leather boots and a cotton wrap around my head and neck against the dust. Shaft 4-B had been partially cleared to a depth of approximately 9 meters. There was a lateral passage branching east at the 7-meter mark, which had not yet been fully assessed. This is what I had been asked to document, specifically a section of painted plaster visible through the passage mouth that Paula had identified during her last descent as potentially bearing cartouche inscriptions consistent with early 12th dynasty regnal notation. This matters. I want you to understand what the 12th dynasty represents before I continue, because without that context, what follows will seem like the account of a frightened woman in a dark hole, and I will not allow it to be reduced to that. The 12th dynasty of ancient Egypt begins approximately in 1991 BC, which is to say nearly 4,000 years before I climbed down that rope. It was inaugurated by a man whose name translates, with a particular and almost self-fulfilling irony, as Amun is at the front. His throne name, the name by which he is best known to history, is Amenemhat I. He was not born to the throne. He was a vizier, the highest administrative official under the previous king, and he either engineered a coup or was handed power during a period of political dissolution at the end of the 11th dynasty. The record is incomplete, as Egyptian administrative records tend to be when the subject is inconvenient. What the record does tell us, and this is the part that has always unsettled me, long before the night in the shaft is how he died. Amenemhat I was assassinated, in his own palace, at night, by men who were inside the building with him. The text known as the Instruction of Amenemhat, a literary composition written in his voice, describes the event in terms that are startling in their specificity for a document nearly 4,000 years old. He describes waking to the sound of weapons. He describes fighting without his full armor because there was no time. He describes the intimacy of the betrayal. These were not foreign invaders, not strangers at the gate. These were court insiders, his own bodyguard. Men who slept inside the palace walls, men whose faces he knew, men who ate at tables near the throne, and whose loyalty was the foundation upon which every day of his 30-year reign had been built. And the text, written ostensibly as a posthumous warning to his son and successor Senusret I, carries in its language a quality I have always found more disturbing than dramatic, a quality of exhaustion. Not outrage, not fury, exhaustion, as though the God King, in the final accounting, was simply very tired. He had ruled for approximately 30 years when they killed him. He was in his private chambers. It was night. I descended into shaft 4-B at 0900 hours on the 14th of March. The temperature below the surface dropped immediately. This is always the case at depth, and it is always a surprise regardless of how many times you have experienced it. From 30 degrees Celsius at surface level to approximately 18 within 3 meters of descent. The shaft smelled of limestone dust and something organic underneath it, the deep mineral smell of places that have been sealed and reopened, the exhalation of centuries of compressed air finally moving again. I find that smell clarifying. I always have. It is the smell of actual age, not the performance of antiquity, and it cuts through whatever anxiety you might be carrying on the way down. The lateral passage at 7 meters was approximately 1.2 meters high and perhaps 80 centimeters wide. I had to crouch to enter it. I set my halogen lamp on its tripod, just inside the passage mouth, angled forward, and I stood for a moment at the threshold to let my eyes adjust and to take my first proper look at what I had come to document. The plaster was extraordinary. Paula had not overstated it. The painted surface extended approximately 4 meters along the east wall of the passage before terminating at what appeared to be a sealed doorway, a rectangular limestone slab fitted into the passage end. Its edges mortared, the plaster bore the remains of a processional scene, figures in white linen carrying offerings. Above the procession, a register of hieratic text running in horizontal bands. I could see from where I stood that at least one cartouche was preserved, its oval border intact, the signs inside it slightly abraded but legible. I felt, as I always feel in these moments, a very specific kind of professional satisfaction, the particular pleasure of a thing that is exactly as described, that has survived. I set up my equipment along the right wall of the passage, keeping the left wall clear for movement, and I began photographing systematically from the passage mouth inward, documenting the plaster in sections of approximately half a meter each. This took time. Good archaeological photography is not fast, and by the time I had reached the midpoint of the passage, perhaps 2 meters in, I was aware that a considerable portion of my morning had passed. I checked my watch. 11:40 a.m. I had been in the passage for over 2 hours. I had not noticed. This is not unusual. Focused work collapses time. It was at this point, while I was adjusting my lamp angle to reduce the glare on a particularly detailed section of the processional scene, a figure carrying what appeared to be an alabaster vessel. The detail in the figure's hands, exceptional, that I heard something behind me from the direction of the shaft. A sound that I recorded in my notes at the time as soft, rhythmic, intermittent, like cloth dragged slowly across stone. I turned and looked back toward the passage mouth. The shaft opening was visible as a brighter rectangle of light, not daylight, which could not reach this depth, but the reflected glow of the surface lamp we had positioned at the shaft head. There was nothing in the passage behind me. The sound stopped. I remained still for perhaps 30 seconds. Nothing. I turned back to my work. I want to be very careful here about how I record my state of mind in these early minutes. I was not frightened. I was alert, which is different. Sounds in sealed passage systems are explicable. Thermal contraction of stone, the settling of disturbed debris, the movement of air through gaps you haven't yet identified. I was alert in the way a competent professional is alert in an unfamiliar environment. I made a note in my field book, 11:42 a.m., intermittent dragging sound, direction, shaft side, source, unidentified, and I continued working. I reached the sealed doorway at approximately 1:30 p.m. Close up, it was more remarkable than I had been able to assess from the passage mouth. The limestone slab was not rough-fitted, it had been dressed, its surface carefully smoothed, and it had been set with a degree of care that suggested this was not a service seal or a workman's plug, but something deliberate and formal. The mortar at its edges had been applied in 2 layers, which I could see in cross-section at a point near the lower left corner where a diagonal crack had allowed partial separation. This crack, I am attaching a photograph of it to this account, taken that afternoon, roll 5, frame 32. I want it on record as physical evidence, because what I am about to describe will require it. Someone had seen this crack before me. Whether that someone was Paula, or someone from an earlier survey, or someone I have never been able to identify, I do not know. What I do know is what I found in the mortar beside the crack. Pressed into the outer layer, only partially preserved but unmistakable to anyone trained in Middle Kingdom administrative sealing practices, was the impression of a clay seal. The device on the seal the image pressed into it was not a cartouche. It was not a standard necropolis seal of the type used at Lisht. It was a figure, a recumbent man, horizontal, arms at sides. Above the figure, 3 vertical signs. I transcribed them into my notebook with a hand that I notice, looking back at it, was not entirely steady, not from fear, but from the particular physical response of recognizing something that should not be where it is. The signs read, in transliteration, I am Amenemhat. Amenemhat. I sat with my back against the opposite wall of the passage for what I later determined was approximately 20 minutes, though my sense of time had become unreliable. I ate a portion of my dry ration. I drank water. I looked at the seal impression, and I looked at my transcription, and I did both of these things multiple times to be certain I had not made an error. I had not made an error. The seal was consistent in its hieratic sign forms with early 12th dynasty administrative practice. Its condition, the degree of preservation, the sharpness of the impression was consistent with original sealing. It had not been placed here recently. It was not a fake, not a reproduction, not a misidentification. I was looking at a seal on a secondary passage doorway at Lisht North, in a location that had not been recorded in any previous survey of this site. This meant one of two things. Either the passage and its sealed chamber beyond were a previously unknown administrative installation associated directly with the royal estate of Amenemhat I, which would be a significant discovery, career-defining, the kind of thing that gets excavations refunded and careers extended, or the seal had been placed here secondarily, reused, which was less exciting but more common. I needed to photograph it, document it fully, and report it. That was all. That was the job. I was setting up the camera for close-range seal photography when I heard the sound again. It was not behind me this time. It was in front of me, from beyond the sealed door. I stopped. I held the camera against my chest, and I listened. The sound was, and I want to be exact, because this is the part of the record that I know will be read with skepticism, and I want my language to be surgical. The sound was respiratory. It had the cadence of breath, slow inhalation, a pause, slow exhalation, not fast, not panicked, deliberate. The breath of a person who is asleep, or who is trying to appear asleep, or who is in a state that I do not have a clinical word for. It came through the crack in the lower left corner of the sealed door. I know this because when I leaned toward the crack, the sound increased in volume, and when I moved away, it decreased. I picked up my radio, I pressed transmit, and said, "This is Renata at 4-B, lateral passage, requesting check-in with the site director. Please respond." I released the button. Static. I tried again. More static. At depth, in a narrow passage with limestone walls, radio transmission is unreliable. I knew this. I had known this when I descended. I pressed transmit a third time, and I am aware of how this sounds. I am aware, and I said, "This is Renata in the lateral passage. There is a sealed doorway. There is a seal impression, early 12th dynasty, possibly regnal, and there is a sound I cannot account for. I need someone down here." I released the button. Static. I sat with the sealed door for what I estimated was another hour, during which the breathing sound continued, with no variation in pace or rhythm. It did not speed up, it did not slow, it did not stop. One inhalation, approximately every 4 seconds. A pause of approximately 2 seconds. One exhalation of approximately 3 seconds. I timed it on my watch. I wrote the timings in my notebook. I photographed the crack. I photographed the seal impression from 6 angles. I photographed the full surface of the sealed door. I did all the things I was trained to do, and I did them carefully, and the sound continued behind the door the entire time. At some point during this period, I cannot pinpoint exactly when, because I had stopped checking my watch with any regularity, I became aware of something else. The temperature in the passage had dropped again. Not the gradual cooling of a deep space equalizing with the surface. I knew what that felt like. This was faster, perhaps 3 or 4 degrees in less than 20 minutes. I noticed it first as a change in how the lamplight fell on the wall plaster. In cold air, the colors seemed to pull back, to become slightly more muted, and the painted figures in the processional scene appeared, in the altered light, to have shifted their posture. I know how this sounds. I am recording it because it is what I observed. The figures had not moved. Paint on plaster does not move. The light had changed because the air had changed, and in the new quality of that light, the angles of the painted limbs appeared different from how they had appeared when I arrived. The figure with the alabaster vessel, the one whose detail had impressed me earlier, was the one I looked at longest. Its hands, which I had noted earlier for their exceptional articulation, appeared now to be positioned differently. The vessel appeared lower, the fingers appeared more extended. I photographed the section again. When I compared the two photographs later, and I have compared them many times, with a loupe, the painted image is identical in both frames. The figures did not move. I am putting this in the record not as evidence of the supernatural, but as evidence of what the human perceptual system does under specific conditions of stress, cold, and auditory disturbance. The brain pattern matches. It fills gaps. It tells you things have changed when what has actually changed is your own state of attention. I tell myself this. I told myself this then. I am less certain of it now than I was. At approximately 3 p.m., I looked at my watch deliberately and recorded the time in my notebook. The breathing sound changed. It had been constant for 2 hours. And then, for a period of perhaps 10 seconds, it stopped entirely. No sound from behind the sealed door. Silence, of the kind that only exists underground, in limestone, in the middle of the desert. A silence so complete it has a physical texture, like pressing cotton against your ears. And then the breathing resumed. But it was faster now, shallower. The cadence had changed from the slow, measured rhythm of deep sleep to something more like the rapid, shallow breathing of a person who has just been startled awake, a person who has heard something, a person who is now listening. The irrational part of my mind, the part I have spent a career suppressing and which asserted itself in that passage, with more force than I would like to admit, told me very clearly, it heard you. It heard your camera shutter. It heard you moving. It has been aware of you for some time, and it has been deciding what to do, and it has just decided. The rational part of my mind reminded me that I was in a sealed limestone passage in the Egyptian desert, that the sound was most likely a geological phenomenon, gas venting from a decomposition event in the sealed chamber, moving through the crack in a pattern that resembled respiratory cadence by coincidence, which is the kind of coincidence that terrifies human beings precisely because we are biologically wired to hear breath everywhere, to detect the presence of other living things, and that the change in the sound's rhythm was consistent with a change in the pressure differential that would naturally occur as exterior temperatures began their afternoon shift. I picked up my equipment. I backed out of the lateral passage to the shaft junction. I climbed the shaft. It took me longer than it should have, because my arms were not working with their full coordination, which I attribute to the cold and to spending several hours in a crouched position, and not to anything else. I came out into the afternoon sun, and I sat in the sand, and I looked at the sky for a while. What I am going to write next is the part of this account that I have considered omitting. I have decided not to omit it because the mandate of this record is accuracy, and an accurate record that has been selectively edited is simply a lie with better presentation. I went back the next morning. I went back because I am an epigrapher, and the inscriptions on that passage wall were the most significant thing I had personally encountered in 11 years of fieldwork, and I was not willing to leave them undocumented. I went back because the sealed door needed to be formally registered before anyone else encountered it, because an unregistered sealed doorway in an active excavation site is a liability and a potential loss. I went back because, and I will write this plainly, I needed to know whether the sound was there in the daytime. I descended at 07:30 on the 15th of March. I had told the site director about the seal impression. He was, as expected, extremely interested, and had said he would arrange for a formal team assessment within the week. He had not asked me not to continue documentation in the interim. I had not asked his explicit permission. These are the kinds of administrative gaps that feel reasonable in the moment and less reasonable in retrospect. The passage was exactly as I had left it. My equipment marks were still visible in the dust. The sealed door was unchanged. The seal impression was exactly as I had photographed it. The crack in the lower left corner was unchanged. I set up my lamp, checked my radio, still unreliable at depth, but not entirely without function, and I stood at the threshold of the passage for several minutes, listening. No sound. I spent the morning completing my photographic documentation and working on the inscription, transcription, which required tracing paper rubbing on several sections where the painted plaster had become too abraded for clear photography. The processional figures were consistent with early 12th dynasty funerary iconography, offering bearers standard type, well executed, but not exceptional. The hieratic text above them was more interesting. It was not a standard offering formula. It was a section of what appeared to be a longer narrative text, a record of events, not a prayer or an inventory. The sign forms were clear enough in most sections that I could make a working transcription of approximately 60% of the text. I worked carefully, kneeling close to the wall, tracing each sign, cross-referencing my sign list. This is slow work. It requires the kind of attention that leaves no room for peripheral awareness. I was perhaps 90 minutes into the transcription work when I realized I had been hearing the sound for some time without consciously registering it. Not the slow, deep breathing of the day before, something different. A sound that I initially categorized as the scrape of my own pencil against the tracing paper or the movement of my clothing against the wall, and which I, then, in the way, you suddenly hear something you have been unhearing, recognized as a voice. Not words, not intelligible speech, a low, continuous vocalization. Below the threshold of language, but above the threshold of pure sound. A tone that rose and fell in a pattern that, if you applied a musical framework to it, might be described as recitative, the kind of half-speech, half-song used in formal address in liturgy, in court ceremony, in the reading aloud of official texts. I had my pencil against the tracing paper, and I did not move it. I remained completely still. The sound continued. It was coming from behind the sealed door. I want to record the specific quality of my fear at this moment because I think it is diagnostically important. It was not the fear of physical threat, the sudden spike of adrenaline, the flight response. It was slower than that. It was the fear of implication, the fear of what it means if the thing you are hearing is real. Because if that sound was real, if there was a human voice behind a sealed door in a passage that had been mortared shut for, conservatively, nearly 4,000 years, then something was wrong with the world in a way that my education and my training and my 11 years of professional experience had absolutely no framework for addressing. And I found that the potential framework failure more frightening than anything the sound itself communicated. I made myself move. I made myself pick up my radio and press transmit. I said, clearly, into the receiver. This is Renata in 4-B lateral passage. I am hearing a vocalization from behind the sealed door. I need someone down here. Please respond. I released. Static. I tried twice more. Static. The vocalization continued. It did not change when I spoke. It did not respond to my voice. This is the detail I keep returning to. It did not alter in any way when I introduced sound into the passage. It was not reactive. It was not calling out, not answering, not acknowledging. It was simply present. As though it had always been present and would continue to be present regardless of whether I was there to hear it or not. As though it predated me by a very significant margin and would outlast me by the same. I began transcribing it. I don't know why I did this. Professional reflex. Perhaps the epigrapher's response to unidentified vocalization is to attempt to record it. I wrote phonetically in my notebook, doing my best to notate the sounds as I heard them, using the Egyptian transliteration system I had been trained in. The vocalization was not Egyptian. Not exactly, or rather, it was not contemporary spoken Egyptian, not Arabic, not any language I could identify. But the phoneme set was consistent with reconstructed Middle Egyptian, the consonants, the vowel approximations, the guttural stops. It was consistent in its sound palette with what we believe Middle Kingdom Egyptian sounded like, based on comparative Semitic linguistics and Coptic transmission. I am not claiming I understood it. I am claiming it sounded like what dead language sounds like when you have spent your career learning its written remains. I sat with the sealed door for 4 hours on the 15th of March. I transcribed what I heard as carefully as I could. I photographed the door again from every angle. I measured the crack precisely 2.3 centimeters at its widest point, running diagonally for approximately 18 centimeters across the lower left quadrant. I noted that the crack appeared, in the oblique light of my halogen lamp, to have a faint darkening at its inner edge, a thin, dark residue on the interior face of the limestone that I initially thought was carbon deposit, organic material from the sealed interior, and which I later, looking at the enlarged photographs, could not convincingly characterize as anything other than what it appeared to be in the close-range image. A dark staining of the stone, consistent with liquid that had, very long ago, seeped from within the chamber and dried on the inner edge of the crack. The color was consistent with oxidized iron. The color was consistent with blood. I climbed out at approximately 12:30 p.m. on the 15th. I sat in the sun again. I ate. I drank water. I organized my notes and my film cassettes. I did not tell anyone what I had heard. I wrote my preliminary field report on the sealed doorway in entirely standard terms: location, dimensions, seal identification, photographic inventory, recommended next steps. I submitted it to the site director by hand that afternoon. He was pleased. He said the formal assessment team would be convened within the week. I did not sleep on the night of the 15th. I lay in my camp cot and looked at the ceiling of the canvas tent and listened to the desert, which at night produces its own set of sounds: wind, temperature shifts, the occasional distant animal, and I thought about a man who had ruled a unified empire for 30 years, who had organized the consolidation of Middle Kingdom power, who had built his mortuary complex at Lisht as a deliberate echo of the Old Kingdom pyramid fields at Giza, a conscious statement of dynastic legitimacy, of historical continuity, and who had been killed in his own bedroom by men he trusted, at night, while he slept, or perhaps while he was awake. The instruction text is ambiguous on this point. He describes fighting. He describes reaching for weapons, which implies he had time to reach, which implies he was conscious when it began. The instruction of Amenemhat has long been understood by Egyptologists as a literary composition, a wisdom text written in the king's voice, posthumously, perhaps by his son's scribes, perhaps as court propaganda establishing the legitimacy of Senusret I's reign by framing the transition of power as an ordained, intended thing. Many scholars believe the text is entirely fictional in its autobiographical claims, that the assassination narrative is a literary device, not a historical record, that Amenemhat I perhaps died of illness, of old age, of any number of natural causes that would be less useful for a succession narrative, and that his death was retroactively dramatized. I believe this too. For 11 years, I believed this. I was trained in a tradition that treats the instruction as literary evidence, not historical testimony. I wrote 2 papers in this vein. One was published. I am not certain I believe it anymore. On the morning of the 16th of March, I descended into shaft 4-B for the 3rd time. I did not tell the site director I was going. I left a note in my tent with the shaft designation and the time of my descent and the instruction to send someone if I had not returned by 3 p.m. I have asked myself many times whether this was a responsible decision. The answer is no. I know the answer is no. I am recording it accurately anyway. The passage was cold from the moment I entered the lateral section, colder than the previous mornings. Cold, in the way that limestone passages are cold when the surface temperature has not yet transmitted its warmth downward. It was early, barely past 7 a.m., and the desert had not yet accumulated its daily heat. This is the rational explanation. The passage was cold because it was early morning in March and I was 9 meters below the surface. I am including this explanation because I want the record to reflect that I applied it, that I was trying. The vocalization was audible from the moment I cleared the passage mouth, not louder than before, not more urgent, exactly as it had been: the same cadence, the same tonal register, the same quality of sustained, unhurried enunciation, as though it had been continuing through the night, as though it had not paused when I left, as though it did not require my presence to continue, had never required my presence, and would continue with or without an audience for as long as the stone held. I did not set up my equipment. I walked directly to the sealed door, and I put my face close to the crack and I listened. The phoneme sequence I had been partially transcribing over the previous day, I recognized a section of it, not from the field, not from a hieratic text in an archive, from a class I had taken in Oxford in the autumn of 1980 in a seminar on Middle Kingdom literary compositions, in which the instructor, an elderly Welsh Egyptologist who had spent 40 years reconstructing the phonology of classical Egyptian, had read aloud, to demonstrate the reconstructed sound of the language, a passage from the instruction of Amenemhat. He had read it in reconstructed Middle Egyptian pronunciation, which is an exercise in scholarly speculation rather than certainty, but which is based on the best available comparative evidence, and I remembered the sound of it because it was the first time the ancient language had entered my ears as something resembling speech rather than marks on a page, and it had made the hair on my arms stand up then too. The passage the old instructor had read, in 1980, in a seminar room in Oxford, was the passage in which the king describes the night of the assassination. The passage in which he says, "I was asleep. The weapons were at my back before I was awake. I had not prepared myself for fighting in the night. And there was no one. What I heard through the crack in the sealed door sounded like a version of that passage. Not identical, the acoustic distortion was significant, the reconstruction is uncertain at best, and I cannot make a definitive claim. But the phoneme clusters, the rhythm of the phrases, the places where the vocalization dropped and rose, it matched, not perfectly but recognizably, the cadence of what I had heard in that seminar room 12 years earlier. I pulled back from the crack. I stood in the passage. My lamp was casting its clean white light across the sealed doorway and the painted processional figures and the hieratic text above them, and I stood very still and I thought about thresholds, about the specific meaning of sealed doors in ancient Egyptian mortuary architecture, about what a sealed door is not. Architecturally, it is not a lock. A seal in the Egyptian mortuary context is not a security measure against the living. It is a boundary condition for the dead. It defines the limit of where a thing is permitted to go, the living side, the dead side. The limestone between them is not a barrier so much as an agreement. You are here, and I am there, and neither of us will cross. The crack in the lower left corner was 2.3 centimeters wide. Nothing was going to cross it. I am certain of this. I was certain of it then. The boundary was intact. The agreement was holding. And yet I stood in that passage, and I listened to a voice that I had no category for, reciting a text about a night of violence in a palace that no longer stood, in a city that no longer existed. And I thought about what it costs a thing to keep talking, what it takes to sustain that. 4,000 years of continuous recitation in the dark, behind a limestone wall, in the desert, with no audience. I thought about the 30 years before the assassination, the consolidation of power, the construction of monuments, the administrative reform of a fractured kingdom, the intelligence required, the endurance. And then I thought about the moment when the men came, men who knew where he slept, men who had been inside the palace long enough to know which corridor to use and which guard post to pass and which moment of the night to choose, the systematic intimacy of it, the specific horror of being killed by your own protection. The text says, "There was no one." That is the line I kept returning to, not, "They betrayed me," not, "I was defeated." There was no one. When I needed someone, there was no one. That sentence, in the voice I was hearing through the crack, did not sound like propaganda. It did not sound like a literary device. It sounded like the specific, irreducible distillation of what it is to be a person, a god king, a professional, an ordinary human being who has reached the moment of extremity, and discovered that the people they relied on are gone. I am not a sentimental person. I want that on the record. I am trained in the analysis of texts, not in their emotional reception, but I stood in that passage and I listened and I felt something that I am going to record as grief because that is the most accurate word I have for it, and I am committed to accuracy. I left the passage at 8:40 a.m. I collected my equipment from where I had set it down at the passage mouth. I climbed the shaft. I walked to my tent and I retrieved the note I had left, and I sat on my cot and I wrote these pages. The formal assessment team descended into shaft 4-B on the 21st of March, 1992. I was not present by that point. I had left the site, citing a personal matter. The team's preliminary report, which I was provided a copy of by a colleague 3 months later, recorded the sealed doorway, documented the seal impression as potentially consistent with early 12th Dynasty administrative sealing, and recommended further investigation pending budget allocation. The report noted that the acoustic properties of the lateral passage were unusual, specifically that team members had observed what they described as a low-frequency resonance phenomenon attributed to the passage geometry and the differential air pressure across the sealed door's crack, producing under specific thermal conditions a sound that several team members independently described in their notes as like breathing, and which two members described more specifically as like someone talking. The report categorized this as a geological phenomenon, a resonance anomaly, an acoustic artifact of the space. I read this section of the report several times. I do not disagree with the categorization. I cannot disagree with it on scientific grounds. What I have is the transcription I made over the course of 3 mornings, sitting with my face against a crack in a limestone door, writing down the sounds I heard in a sealed chamber in a site associated with the first pharaoh of the 12th dynasty, a king who was murdered in his own palace at night by men who were supposed to be protecting him and who left behind him, in the text that carries his name, the words, "There was no one. When I needed someone, there was no one." The inscription work I completed on the passage walls was later assessed by a colleague at the University of Milan, who confirmed my reading of the hieratic text above the processional scene. It was not a standard offering formula. It was, she confirmed, a section of narrative administrative text, partially legible, recording in the third person an account of a nocturnal event at a royal residence. The surviving sections described, in the formal, compressed language of administrative record, the securing of a chamber, the placement of a seal, the boundary conditions. She asked me where exactly I had found it. I told her. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, in all of the 12th dynasty material she had worked, she had never seen a text like this outside of a literary composition. She had never seen administrative language used to describe something she paused over before naming. She said, "A continuing presence." I have thought about that phrase for 7 months. A continuing presence. The formal, administrative language of a bureaucratic culture describing, without apparent alarm, and with the measured precision of professional record keeping, the ongoing management of something that had not, in their assessment, concluded. Something that had been sealed. Something that had been given a boundary. Something that, in the limestone passage of a site 60 kilometers south of Cairo, in the cold morning air of 1992, was still in whatever form the word still can be made to mean, stretched across the distance of nearly 4,000 years, still present. The last thing I wrote in my transcription notebook on the morning of the 16th, before I left the passage, was not a phoneme sequence. It was a note to myself. I wrote, "It is not in distress. It is not calling for help. It is reciting. It is performing, in the only way available to it, the function for which it was trained. It is the record of a king who could not stop telling what happened to him in a room sealed against the night, for reasons that made complete sense 4,000 years ago, and that I am not qualified to dismantle. The crack in the door measured 2.3 centimeters. The seal on the outer edge was consistent with early 12th dynasty administrative practice. I did not cross the threshold. The agreement held. I am writing this account because I believe it belongs in a record somewhere, and because I think that the thing on the other side of that door, whatever it is, whatever the correct category for it turns out to be, deserves to have someone say plainly that it was heard, that it was attended to, for 3 mornings, by at least one person who sat close enough to catch its sound and tried, with the best tools she had, to write it down. I hope someone finds this file. I hope they read it carefully and then go back to the records from the Lisht North 1992 excavation season and pull the photographic rolls from my survey documentation. They should be in the Cairo Museum. Archives. Reference KMT-0041, rolls 2 through 7, and look at frame 32 of roll 5. It is a photograph of the sealed doorway taken in the oblique light of my halogen lamp on the morning of the 15th. In the lower left corner, at the edge of the crack, there is a detail I have not described in the body of this account because I was not certain, when I was in the field, that I was seeing it correctly, and I am not certain now. But it is in the photograph, and photographs do not have the kinds of perceptual difficulties that field researchers have in cold, dark passages after several days of insufficient sleep. In the lower left corner, at the edge of the crack, on the interior face of the sealed door, there is a hand, or the suggestion of a hand dark, thin, the fingers aligned along the edge of the limestone as though pressing gently against the seal from the inside, not breaking through, not forcing the stone, just pressing, the way you press a door to feel whether it will open, the way you check a boundary to see whether the agreement still holds. It holds. I believe it holds. I believe the limestone is enough. I am choosing to believe the limestone is enough because the alternative is something I do not have language for yet, and perhaps no one does, and perhaps that is the most honest conclusion an epigrapher can offer, that there are records older than our ability to read them, and that some of them are still being written. Renata, secondary, epigrapher, KMT 0041, Lisht North Secondary Shaft Complex, filed 16th of March, 1992. This is where her account ends. 14 pages. Her handwriting is extremely neat for the first 9 pages, and less neat for the last 5. I have requested access to the photographic rolls referenced in her final paragraph. The Cairo Museum Archive has confirmed the rolls exist under the designation she cited. They have been listed as pending assessment review since 1994. I am waiting to hear whether I will be granted access. If you found this file in the archives, subscribe so that when the next one is unsealed, you will be the first to hear it. And if you are ever working alone in a sealed passage in the Egyptian desert and you hear from behind a limestone door that has been mortared shut for nearly 4,000 years, a voice reciting in a language that has not been spoken aloud since the Middle Kingdom, do not press your face against the crack. Do not try to listen more closely. Do not try to transcribe it. Back away from the door. Climb out. Sit in the sun. Let the limestone hold the agreement. Some records were sealed for reasons that were very carefully considered by people who understood, far better than we do, exactly what they were sealing in.